Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at that last image I wanted to mask out before we start assembling our postcard. And I believe, and that was a while ago, that the image we were looking at was this buffalo or cow or some kind of fuzzy beast of burden. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And this, I think, won't be too hard to mask out because we have good contrast between the edges, these fuzzy edges, and the background, or at least good enough contrast. It would obviously be better if we had like black and white and all that, but we have some contrast, and you can see between different pieces we have different amounts of contrast. That's good. And the best contrast, of course, would be black and white, but honestly, just this light to this darker color should work. We have some hard edges that will be easy enough on the horns. Even some of this back, we can smooth that out without too much loss. This area is just a bit gray. The tricky bits will be these little strandly bits of hair around the nose as well. Even the chin, since it gets a little bit in there. Maybe this shoulder. I don't know how much of the shoulder we'll want. We may actually want to mask all that out and just use this bit. So let's take a look at that and see what we can do. One more piece I'd like to show you, and this isn't something you'll have to remember at all. There are a lot of times that this actually won't be that useful for you, but sometimes it's just the piece to use, is the calculations. And this works on layers as well as channels, but the fact that it works in channels is great because from a channel we can create a mask, so we can start getting stuff together. So what is calculations? Calculations is almost the prototype before layers had blending modes, like way back in the day. And will allow us to take these pixels and interpret them and squish them together in some way, just like layer blending does. Like when we did the multiply, the layer above would darken the layer below. And that was multiply. It also had the nice effect of the blending layer of multiply knocking out any white that was on the layer that multiply was being applied to. So great too. So we have those kinds of tools, but now we can use them a little with a little more finesse. So rather than me just talk about it, let me go ahead and show you what's going on. Now, the nice thing about calculations is that it will give me the option of creating a new channel. So I don't have to worry about creating a new channel in advance to build the mask in. I can just go straight for it. So I'm just going to go up to Image, Calculations. And it'll pop up this archaic menu of confusion and nonsense that just gets people looking at it going on, what is all of this? What's going on? Why? What's happening? Well, at the top, it's pretty straightforward. Source is just the source from all of the files that you have open. So if you want to have more than one or pull in things from different projects, that's as easy as opening it in advance, then choosing the sources between the two things that'll be applied. Next up, you have the layer within that source, or in other words, the file that you have open. In this case, we only have the background layer. I haven't duplicated anything. Or to cancel out of this and duplicate this, then I would have under Image, Calculations, two layers available. The copy on the background copy and background. I also have the option of what if you merge them all together, which is really useful when you're using transparencies and blending modes and stuff like that. Sometimes you'll want to merge them all together. I only need to use the one here. So under Image, Calculations, you should write that one down, super useful. You then, after you've selected the layer, have the option of the channels palette for that source file. So in this case, they're both the same source file, so it will be the same options. Right now, we just have the red, the green, the blue, and gray, which is just the RGB set to a grayscale. So we're probably not going to be using that one too much. We have source 2. I'll talk about that in a second. And we have blending. Now, blending is pretty cool. It has all of the standard blending modes that you would have over in your layer. If we were to have two layers, we have normal, dissolve, all that good stuff. But it also has two more. So I love some of these. They're just really pretty. So if we were to go back in again to Image, Calculations, now that's burned in your brain. You notice that we also have add and subtract. Now, this is super, super useful because when you're working just in the grayscale world of channels, you can start pushing things around and just adding lights on top of darks, and then you just get the light, or subtracting darks from lights, and you just get the dark, like that kind of stuff, some basic things. So here's where the confusion usually sets in on this, and I often have to do some Googling whenever I'm breaking open calculations for the first time in a while, because I'll forget what's going on. This blending mode is only being applied to source 1. Source 1 is above source 2. So in other words, you can think of them, if you thought of them as a layer stack, like over here, you would have a bottom layer of source 2 and a top layer of source 1. On source 1, you would be affecting it with blending modes, and it would go down. That's it. That's the confusion that gets everybody every single time. These essentially work like a layer stack, one above the other, and this blending mode applies to the top one. I honestly wish that they had just like moved the blending mode into source 1 so you knew that's what was happening, or if they labeled blending for source 1 or anything like that, but this has remained pretty much unchanged since the dawn of time, so they're not going to change it now. You have a couple of tools if you were to go into the add or subtract that are unique to it. You have offset and you have scale. We'll talk about that in just a second. We'll come back to those. You also have opacity. You have the ability to mask things. We're not going to touch on that because that's a mask inside of the channel that's creating the mask. If we need to, we'll get back to that later. For now, we're just going to leave that alone. So we have results. We can make a new document entirely, a new channel, which is probably what we'll be doing, or a new selection, which is great because you can go back in and apply things immediately. But we're going to be piecemealing this together. So we're going to have a bunch of little channels, and then we'll smush them together using the calculations again. So we're going to be taking this in a bunch of little steps. We're going to, for example, take out this chunk right here so that we can get this fuzzy outline, maybe a chunk at the top of his head, maybe a chunk at his chin. Like I was saying, I don't think we really need to worry about the back. And then we'll assemble all of that into one big piece, and then we'll get it nice and tight. It will look pretty good to really great, depending on how much work needs to be done past it. Certainly better than the lion when we were done just adjusting the colors and all that. It was passable for this assignment. It's not something that you want to do if you're working for a magazine. If you'll remember, we still had to do a lot of color cleanup and that kind of stuff. That was just time on task. We'd have to spend a lot of time on that. You already have a lot of videos you're watching this week simply because we're going over all of this again for maybe the first time for a lot of you, maybe the second or third time for some of you. So we'll find out. So what is the offset? What's the scale? Let's go ahead and set a couple of these channels so that we can see that. Let's go for the little chinny chin chin right here, and we'll aim for that. So let's take a look at our channels real quick. So, I think we could do the green on top of itself, but that would be a little confusing, I think, for you guys right now. Red's pretty close to green. What we're going to be doing is cranking up the contrast so we can either direction, lighter or darker, because we can invert things afterwards. We're just going to be increasing the contrast so that we can get his adorable little chin so that we have that separated with all those little hairs. So let's do the red and the green channels. So I'm going to go ahead and pop on back over to Image, Calculations. And let's make the top one red and make the bottom one green. Okay, so we've got add and we've got subtract. We can also invert the channels, which sometimes can be useful. We'll take a look and see. Actually, that might be good. We'll take a look at that in just a second. So offset is just saying on this top layer, how are you going to push that? Do you want it to just be a straight addition? So one luminosity from source 1 is added directly to source 2? Or do you want to add that to source 1 and then maybe have source 1 darker? Now, keep in mind that we have a limit normally of 255. That's all on, that's bright white, but things can clip. In other words, we'll see 255 is white. So if you had like 327 or something crazy, we wouldn't see that. We would just see it as 255, pure white. But the data could still be in there. So if we were to do something like knock this down by an entire level, when we add white to white, now it's not going to jump over 255. It's going to darken it in. So let's see what happens if we invert it. Hey, look at that. That's what we're looking for. So notice that we're getting good contrast between the chin, little chinny chin chin, and the background. That's because I've offset the top layer by 255, which is like an entire level of gamut of white, like the brightest possible thing. But because we're adding such bright stuff to such bright stuff, when it's inverted, that's okay. So a usual rule of thumb is if you choose to use the offset, and it's always a good idea to play with it. If you grab offset, you can scrub it around like left and right. Notice if you start adding to an addition, it gets ridiculously bright. So normally with add, the rule of thumb is to offset it by negatives. And if you're subtracting, to offset it instead with positives, so that it will start coming in. And somewhere in here, we have this. Oh, you know what? This could be really good for the ear and the side of the face. Right here. I'm going to take a quick note of that because it's always a good idea while you're working with channels to have a little piece of scrap paper with you and start writing down the settings as you explore, because sometimes you'll stumble across something that you hadn't thought of. So in this case, subtract, offset 169, and source one is just, well, we only have one layer. We only have one file. I'm not going to bother writing that down. I'm just going to put red, source 2, green, and invert on both of those. We'll come back to that. So for this, like I said, we'll stick with the chin. So we'll do the add, the negative 255. What scale? Scale is doing division on layer 1, on source 1, on all the luminosity levels. So 1 is the default. If you divide anything by 1, it's the original. That's the identity property of division. If you guys haven't had your Math 90 class yet, you'll get to play around with that a whole lot. But otherwise, that's just a rule of mathematics. 1 is the identity property of division, just as 0 is the identity property of addition and subtraction. So if you add 0 to something, it's whatever the original number was. 0 doesn't add anything. You divide something by 1, it's the original thing. It didn't do anything. So this scales like very slowly all the way up to 2. And so dividing something by 2 is pretty big in the world of Photoshop if you think about it, because 255 is white. Divide that by 2, and you get what, 128, I believe. You get gray. You're halfway gone. So if you already started at gray, it's just disappearing entirely. So a lot of times, you want to be careful with the division. It also softens edges, which can be a bit tricky because sometimes you don't want a soft edge. For example, if you're working on the horns, you notice all these grays coming in. It's softening them. So we're going to instead pay attention to the little chin here. And I'm not dragging inside the box. That's not going to do anything. I'm dragging on the word scale. Maybe nothing. Actually, I'm just going to leave it at nothing. All right, well, good to play with, though. So I'm going to make the result a new channel so that I can adjust it further. I'll tell it OK. Boom. Here we have the new alpha channel. If I scroll up in my channels window, or if I were to make my channels window big enough to actually see what I'm doing, come here, channels. There we go. If I were to turn on the eyeball and RGB, you'll see that I get this weird red tint that we keep seeing. And between videos, I actually looked this up. It's actually referenced the default color of the mask being that red-pink color. It's a reference to something called a rubylith. And a rubylith is a way, this piece of plastic, kind of a rubbery plastic apparently. You put it down and you cut chunks of it out, and it's UV resistant. So you use it in the screen printing process. We'll talk about that much later in the semester as to what a screen printing process is and how that has to do with us. But basically, they picked red because that UV-resistant material was used to mask stuff out. And so the rubylith was red. They used a red for these guys. So, hey, pretty cool. Anyway, thought you might like that fact. Let's see what's going on there. If we were to just create a new channel, altogether an alpha channel, notice we just get this solid red. If I use my default colors, flip them with, that's D on the keyboard, flip them with X on the keyboard, get the brush with B, and I select my mask, and I just paint, we can see right through. It's just getting through. If we were to get a black, it would paint it back in. If we were to get a gray, it would fade about half of it away. Remember, it's a grayscale. Masks are grayscale, channels are grayscale. They're not strictly black and white. Often we will want them black and white, but you can do cool stuff like a gradient tool, drag it across, and have things be affected differently if you have, there we go, have things affected differently. This can actually be a really fun effect. We'll deal with that maybe later when we're actually doing the rest of the assignment. Anyway, so if we come over, we can kind of get an idea, see where the red and the black is. All I'm focusing on right now is the chin. So I'm going to turn off the eyeball and the RGB, come back over here. Now, because we're in channels, we can't use adjustment layers. We can only use destructive processes, such as image adjustments levels, which is good old levels. We can come in here and start poking around at the chin, concentrating on the chin, getting that black and that white. So I'm just going to blow out the fur and kick back the background. That's looking pretty good. It's going to be a little jaggedy because I don't want to sit here and fiddling with it for an hour or two. You guys might want to if it's an important part of your piece, but I'm going to shrink this guy down quite a bit, and I know you're excited to be at the end of these videos, so I'm going to go ahead and just drag those in. When I get them this close together, it's kind of like a threshold process. Essentially, it means anything below a certain level becomes black, anything above it becomes white. That's fine. Go ahead and tell it OK. If we leave a little bit of grays in here, then that will be a transition effect. I made it a little too crispy. Sorry about that. Let me get back in there. You don't want it to have those artifacts, those digital artifacts in there, because it will start doing weird damage to things. But we're going to end up with a few of them. Them's the breaks. All right. Yeah, I guess we'll just have to live with it right now because I do want to move on to the rest of it. All right. Tell it OK. You know what? We'll do this in a couple of passes. Control L, grab the white eyedropper tool, come in, click on this gray. There we go. You know what? No. Let's go the other way. Yeah. No, that's fine. Click on this gray. Watch it bounce around. And I don't care what's going on up here or over here. I'm just paying attention to this chin. That's all I'm paying attention to. All right. Okay, cool. So since I'm only paying attention to this chin, I can pop in here with the black and the white brush, and I could just paint away everything else without any concern. Oh, yeah. Now, in places that will, be popping up, I can ignore that because we'll be adding whites together when we're done. So any white on the inside of where this animal is that I really wish I'd looked up the name for before I start talking about it, that's fine. That's not gonna bother us at all. We're going to be adding white on white on white. So we'll just leave this alone, but I'm going to clean up this area right here. So we'll say we have the chin. Okay. And I'm going to name this chin. So how does this work? Well, first I'm going to save what I'm working on because it's always a good idea. And we'll call this masking demo. Animal with masks. And I'm going to go ahead and make another video here where we will do the top of the head, the side of the face, and combine them together. We're going to do all of that using the good old image calculations, and then we'll combine it with our other skills, and we'll have a really nice little cutout. So I will see you guys next video.